Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our show, we're pleased to have Emmanuel Martin Skype in from France to help us better understand the plight of France's restive Muslim immigrants. Dr. Martin is Executive Director at the Institute for Economic Studies and a widely published commentator on the European scene. Emmanuel, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Emmanuel, it's been a month now since the Charlie Hebdo massacre. The initial shock is starting to wear off, and people are beginning to reflect on what it all means. I asked you on the show to give us a larger view from France, and I wonder if we can start with a discussion of French immigration policy. You're from an immigrant family yourself. How have things changed?
Well, things have changed because of the welfare state, basically. The problem is that people don't want to see it. It's politically incorrect to say this. My family came from Italy back in the 1920s and the 1930s. And the way they integrated or were assimilated in the French society was through work. They just had to work very hard in order to make a living. And that's the way they were able to send their kids to school and to, in the end, integrate, as we say over here. The problem today is that we have a very, at the same time, generous and very restrictive welfare state. We have a very restrictive welfare state in the sense that we have a lot of regulations, especially on the labor market, but also regulations of businesses. And it's very difficult for poor people with a fairly low level of human capital in fairly small communities, which means a fairly small division of labor and specialization, to be productive enough for the level of regulations, especially the minimum wage that we have, which is fairly high, and compete on the labor market. Because of those regulations, many of those immigrants are excluded de facto from the labor market and from the, business life.
And how do they survive?
Well, they survive through the generous welfare state. So on one hand, the welfare state is very restrictive, and on the other hand, it's very generous. We have a very generous welfare state here in France. But by being very generous, it's very easy, especially if you have many kids. It's very easy to get a lot of money from the state through family benefits.
Has this changed the character of the immigrants? Rather than having hard workers come for economic opportunity, families now come just to live on the benefits?
My view on this, and I spent a good deal of time in those very rough suburbs when I did my national service, so I know what I'm talking about. It's not just someone speaking from the ivory tower. Yes, people have changed. The perception that people have on the way to integrate French society has changed. Because the welfare benefits just generate apathy and dependency. You just sit there and wait for the benefits for the welfare benefits to fall on your bank account. And this is terrible. I'm not saying that people are doing this on purpose. Once again, they're being excluded. So they're sort of being caught between a rock and a hard place.
They're not allowed to start businesses that immigrants would normally do.
Yes, exactly, because it's too costly. France is a highly regulated country. If you look at the Index of Economic Freedom of the World, published by the Fraser Institute and the Cato Institute, you can see that in the category regulation, France is ranked 74th, I think.
Wow.
Which is not exactly good. So obviously those people are facing huge costs in order to enjoy business life, especially the minimum wage we have. Nobody mentions this. I know that you guys in America have debates now about the minimum wage that Obama wants to raise. In France, we have a very high minimum wage. It's about 71% of the median wage, which is actually a lot.
So basically, the youth can't get jobs.
It's not only the youth, but it's also all the people who have a fairly low amount of human capital, which means immigrants most of the time. With a very high minimum wage, you just prevent them from working. In France, we have this very centralized way of thinking that equalitarian way of thinking. There should be the same rule for everybody at the same level, blah, blah. And it's very dangerous because the assumption behind this is that the whole country has the same development level, right? Which is not true.
Yeah,
which is
it
not
doesn't
true.
allow for differences.
Yeah, it does not allow for differences in economic development. And it's terrible.
So if Muslim immigrants are being blocked from assimilation economically, are they being absorbed culturally through the education system?
Well, that's the other problem. You know, we had 1968. It was a famous social revolution that we had, which was against conservatism, which was against authority, and which sort of injected some form of relativism in many aspects of society, including education, obviously. And since 1968, the level in schools has tended to decline, especially since the 1990s. This was the other turn. At the time, the government decided that 80% of a generation had to have what we call the A level here, which is the pre-university grade. And the idea was that we had to copy Japan, because in Japan, 80% of the new generation had the A level, so we had to do the same.
But they don't have immigrants in Japan.
The difference was in Japan, the pupil had to work in order to get the A level. In France, we decided to lower the level of the exams in order to have the 80% of the generation to have the A level. It's actually a lie. We were lying to people. But the impact of this was a huge decline, a very rapid decline, and I could see that. I've been teaching in universities for 15 years now, and you can see the decline in the way people write. Sometimes you have to read aloud the papers in order to try to understand what they're trying to say, which is a catastrophe because you should not have people like this in universities. And when you're an immigrant and you're not integrated like this with the educational system, it's impossible. Worse than that, it's the not only the level which has declined, but also the atmosphere of civility, of respect, of tolerance. When I did my national service in what we call collège, which is the school you go when you're between 10 and 14, I don't know how many times kids spat on me or called me a mother, F-U-C, The first time was absolutely shocking, and then you just get used to it. I remember entering these classrooms in which the teacher would teach on the blackboard, and the kids were just playing and throwing papers or throwing tables or chairs at their feet. I mean, you can't believe that.
No discipline.
No discipline. And that was more than 15 years ago.
So, Emmanuel, the Muslim immigrants have been blocked economically by strict labor laws. They're not being assimilated because the educational institutions have declined significantly. There seems to be a much higher tolerance for violence also. We turn on the TV here in the United States, and it seems like every weekend in the Paris suburbs, they're burning cars. What's going on?
It's the lack of rule of law. It starts in schools. You have places which are no-go places for the police, especially in my city, Marseille. The police, they can't go there in some of the places.
There's been a lot of controversy lately in the U.S. by people claiming that these no-go zones are fictitious.
In the center of Paris, yes, that is true. This was an exaggeration from the U.S. media. But you should come to the suburbs of Marseille or Paris, and that's a different story.
Emmanuel, is Europe in general and France in particular facing a war of civilizations?
That's the question that many people, and Marine Le Pen and all those people are actually using this, and it's we have to deal with it. It's complicated.
How so?
There is a war of Islamic fundamentalism in Europe and the world today, in many countries, in the Middle East and in Africa. Yes, there is. But it's not a war of Islam. It's a war of some lunatics who claim to speak in the name of Islam. We have 6 million Muslims in France. If each of them was a terrorist, we would be in a very difficult position.
So you see it as a minority movement right now?
Absolutely, yes. But we have to deal with it. Even though it's only 1,000 or 2,000 persons, it's a problem.
Do you see any changes in the way French society is dealing with this in the aftermath of the Hebdo massacre?
Yes. Before that, it was a bit politically incorrect to criticize Muslims for being against caricatures and all this. And today, people speak out. Non-Muslims speak out and say, okay, we have freedom of expression. That's what we want. If you don't like it, tough luck.
As a result of this, is the National Front gaining more popularity in France, Marine Le Pen's right-wing movement?
Actually, if you look at the polls that we had just after the attacks, no, the polls tell you that it didn't change. The big winner was Manuel Valls, the prime minister, who was very tough. But the ideas of Marine Le Pen are actually winning because more and more people are being, skeptical about Islam. Maybe she will try to capitalize on this because we are going to have local elections in 2 months. We'll see.
Going back to our earlier conversation about how the welfare state and economic barriers have prevented the assimilation of Muslim immigrants, is French society willing to rethink their restrictive labor laws?
No, they have no idea. Most people don't make the connection between labor laws, regulations, and the problem of integration. That's the drama.
Interesting. Tell us more about that.
No politicians even see that. Oh, maybe Alain Madelin, a libertarian politician. But most of them don't understand the link between the lack of economic integration and the lack of integration in a broader sense. Even Alain Juppé, Alain Juppé is supposed to be the reformer on the right. And when you ask him about the minimum wage, about scrapping the minimum wage, and he tells you, no, that's a French Republican idea. We can't leave the minimum wage system that we have. You have to understand this French ideology of republicanism. I mean, the French republicanism. We're not talking about the American one, which is very centralized, very equalitarian. And it's very difficult for this whole class of politicians to understand how this ideology is actually going against economic freedom.
But this implies that the problem is only going to grow and fester.
Yes, I'm very pessimistic about it, especially after the announcement that the government gave after the attacks. The government made a few announcements about how they will deal with the issue of Islamic fundamentalism and things like this. And it's just, the same old story. They're not going to change the problems with education. How can we change the problems in education? Well, by freeing the schooling system we have. In France, we have a system called la carte scolaire, the school map, which is school zoning, which means that parents don't have the right to send their kids to the school they want. I mean, public school they want. They are forced to send their kids in the local public school, which means that poor people remain with poor people and rich kids with rich kids. Everything is like this. They're not going to change it. They're not going to reform this. Same thing with the suburbs. The prime minister talked about a policy of population, a population policy, populating policy. I don't like that. It's top down. There's nothing about economic freedom. There's nothing about policies that could increase the opportunities of those people. Nothing about empowerment of those people. Housing, social housing. Those people are locked up in ghettos, urban ghettos that have been designed by architects very much influenced by central planning ideas, in which we call them cité, the suburbs. We call them cité, which means city. But there's nothing of city life. It's just
warehousing.
Yeah, social housing. There's no businesses. There's no place for businesses because businesses were not even thought by the architects, by the urban planners. And this will not change. What we have to do is to change the policies of ownership. We have to make sure that those people can become owners of their houses, of their flats. But nothing was said about this.
Assuming the French are going to remain French, they're not going to fix their economy, they're going to continue to support the welfare state, isn't the only other answer to cut off immigration?
That's what Marine Le Pen says. She wants a big welfare state, but only for the French. even socialists say that maybe we should close the frontiers and things like, well, not close the frontiers, but it was Michel Rocard, a great socialist, who once said 25 years ago that France was not able to welcome all the misery of the world, which, well, it's quite meaningful. So I think in the end, they will have to do something about this, to close the frontiers, which is terrible because it means all the beautiful talents that we can get from immigration, we won't have them. So maybe they will have, like they do in Switzerland, we do it also in France. Since Sarkozy, we've done it. We sort of have categories of migrant workers that we welcome, but don't welcome the others. So there's some sort of central planning of immigration.
With two-tiered citizenship.
Yeah.
Along with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in France has been the resurgence of anti-Semitism. There seems to be an exodus of Jews from France. The levels are going up. 20 years from now, will there be any Jews left?
Yes, it is true that many Jews are actually fleeing the country. They're going to Israel or to the U.S. because they're scared about what's going on in France. You know, we've had lots of demonstrations last summer that degenerated into riots against the Jews. The demonstrations were pro-Palestine, and in the end, they turned into anti-Semitic demonstrations. So I understand that Jews in this country might want to leave the country. That's why we really need to do something. In French, we have this vivre ensemble, live together sort of motto. If the government doesn't implement policies that increase economic freedom in order to increase economic integration of those populations, we're going to, not a clash of civilization, that's probably too catastrophic to call it like this, but we're going to have a clash between communities, that's for sure.
Well, and how will this be exacerbated if the euro unwinds and France heads toward bankruptcy?
Yeah, that might be complicated. Look at what's going on in Greece. That's a huge issue. I don't have a very specific answer with precision. And that's why the quantitative easing policies of the ECB were actually announced earlier this year, is to prevent a catastrophe like this from happening. I mean, a bankruptcy of big countries like France. But if this was to happen and the French decided to keep their welfare state and high regulations and all this, that means if the French would vote for the National Front and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far left, exactly like the Greeks voted for Syriza or for Golden Dawn, this would be very, very, very worrying. Yes, indeed.
Well, history has a tendency to maybe not repeat itself, but at least rhyme. If you look at the comparison between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, we saw some very different outcomes. The American Revolution left us with a constitutionally limited republic, and the French Revolution left us with a reign of terror. Is that embedded in the French character?
I would say yes.
Whoa.
Not the French character, the French type of governance. You have to understand that France was constructed on centralization, on constant centralization. And the best way for the government of France, in order to get rid of separatism, is to divide and rule. This might sound paradoxical, but the way that the French government was able to divide and rule was to suppress civil society. If you look at what happened during the French Revolution, the French Revolution started like nearly libertarian revolution, and it very quickly ended in the terror, as you said. And the way they did this was to suppress all the corps intermédiaires, the intermediary bodies, which means civil society. It's embedded in the DNA of the French governance that centralization is so important in France that the government and the politicians won't give way. Even if you look at the decentralization laws that we had some 30 years ago, they were not decentralization at all. They were just a way for the government to give a little bit of crumbs to the local powers, you see.
Emmanuel, you paint a rather dark picture. What can be done to save France from a tragic destiny?
Freedom, more economic freedom, more personal freedom. And that's why people like myself and many of my friends were trying to push these ideas of freedom, because without freedom, you can't have dignity, whether you're an immigrant or not. And if we don't have that type of policies, it's going to be chaos very soon, because the welfare state, especially in the French context, which is very unequalitarian in the bad sense of the term, has created conflict within society. And if we are not choosing the path of freedom and liberty very soon, I'm afraid this is going to be bad news very, very soon.
Well, let's hope for a French Spring somewhere along the way. Emmanuel, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
That was Emmanuel Martin, Executive Director at the Institute for Economic Studies, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. If you'd like to hear more, please stop by realclearradio.org to sign up for email updates on our weekly broadcasts or access podcasts of our past programs. That wraps up our show for this week. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.